Welcome to Campfire Football. I'm Sebastian North. Today I want to talk about a story that I wasn't going to get into, I wasn't going to touch because I thought it was already really done and dusted and we could move on and I would just have my own personal opinion about it. This is the Edinson Cavani Ban. Now, for those of you who don't know what happened, I'll get into that in a second, but let me just be clear right from the off. If you were offended by what Edinson Cavani said, I have no issues with that. I'm not going to judge you. I'm not going to criticize you. I have no problem with it whatsoever. But the news we got this morning really made this a much more interesting conversation for us to have. And I'm thankful for that because I did feel that we were missing something if this subject was just going to disappear. So for those of you who don't know what happened, I'll just take this from the top. Edinson Cavani scores the game winner against Southampton a few weeks ago. And after the match, a friend of his, Pablo Hernandez, congratulates him on social media, on Instagram. Edinson Cavani replies, "Gracias, negrito," in text. Now, this really triggered a lot of people. A lot of people in England were very upset about this. Black people, mostly, obviously. There were very many white pundits as well, saying that this was wrong. This needed to be, he needed to be banned. This is not okay. Very quickly, though, a lot of people were understanding of the fact that he didn't mean anything, really. So that had come out pretty quickly. It wasn't like people were just like, we have to pillory Edinson Cavani. That wasn't really the general genuine thought process of people. I think overall people were quite well measured in the whole thing. So that I felt that was pretty good. There were obviously some people who were really, really, really upset, but most of the people I heard speaking about it, a lot of the black players who were active or retired, things that they said were totally reasonable and understandable, and I thought great for the discussion, right? Now, after this happens, he gets a £100,000 fine and a 3-match ban. Now, Cavani and his people appealed it, and United as well, basically saying this is a cultural misunderstanding here. And they got Pablo Hernandez involved as well, where, he provided his own testimony. Now, let me go ahead and just say another thing that was brought forward as evidence by Cavani and his people. They brought a guy, Professor David Wood, an expert in Latin American studies, and he said, quote, "Whilst negrito is commonly used in South America to refer to a male who is of color, someone familiar with South American culture and language could also have understood that in the context of friends, it was not used with the intention to be racist, insulting, or offensive." He goes on, he says, "English native speakers unfamiliar with South American culture would be likely to take offense to the words used, and followers of English Premier League football would have understandably concluded that the words used were racially offensive." Right on all counts, really good explanation. In Latin America, not a big deal. But to people in England, your immediate conclusion is that's racially offensive. So that covers what everyone felt, and I think that's totally true, totally right. Again, if you're black and you were offended, it's totally understandable, completely understandable in an English-speaking culture. Now, Pablo Hernandez, like I said, provided video testimony of him live talking to them saying, "This is my lifelong nickname. I've never taken offense to it." And he provided WhatsApp messages that proved that that's how it is and that clearly there's no offense taken here. Even though all of this was presented, the FA came out with this statement: "Taking all relevant matters into account, a suspension of 3 games rather than the standard minimum of 6 games for this type of offense properly marked the gravity of the players offending." I don't know about you, I disagree. Essentially what they are saying is if you are intentionally racist and offensive, you get the minimum mandatory 6 games. But if you make a mistake by misspeaking or by saying something that you don't even know is culturally offensive in England because you're a foreigner, you get 3. So it's half as bad to make a mistake as it is to be intentionally racist and offensive? Hmm. Yeah, I don't think very many of us actually agree with that at all. I would challenge any of you to tell me that you really disagree. I mean, that to me that's really bizarre, right? That you would, okay, there's a minimum mandatory 6, but if we're really trying to talk about relevant matters, which that's what they said in their quote, that relevant matters, meaning the topic of racism and discrimination, is definitely out in front right now, which is very good. It needs to be. But how you react to certain situations, I think, tells a lot about where you really come from and what you see as most important, right? Now, my own personal experience. I traveled through Latin America myself. I went for 6 months. I went from Costa Rica to Chile back in 2015-16. I speak and understand Spanish pretty well. I'm not fluent, but I can get by anywhere I go in Spanish-speaking countries, and I can actually have good, relatively in-depth conversations with people. And I learned a lot about terminology and nicknames and just the cultural pieces around the language. So I want to talk about 3 little things here that I learned over that time that really have to do with monikers and nicknames, really. So the first one was just being American, saying americano. Soy americano. I'm American. Now, I can go around the world and say that, and people will obviously and rightfully assume I'm from the United States. But in Central America, when I was in Panama working at a hostel for a month with a bunch of Latin Americans on the staff, they told me, somos todos americanos. Tú eres estadounidense. Meaning, we're all Americans. You are just from the United States. And they weren't offended. They weren't mad at me for slipping up and saying, well, as an American, they would just stop me and be like, well, we're all American. Just remember that. It wasn't offensive. They just wanted to check me on it. And I learned something there, which was cool. Now, like I said, there were a lot of Latin Americans here. It was a diverse group of different people and also different looks. We had a couple Costa Ricans, an El Salvadorian, obviously a few Panamanians, a Venezuelan, and a Colombian, right? People's skin tone and sort of what you would think of race and ethnicity was varied. The Venezuelan guy was whiter than me. He looked Irish. The guy needed more sunscreen than I did. Then there was one of the Panamanian guys who was really, really, really dark. He looked way more indigenous, like one of the native people in the San Blas Islands. That's kind of what skin tone he had. And it was fun just being around them and hearing the nicknames that they threw around and the things they would say. The guy from Venezuela was Blanquito because he's white. But I was Gringo because I'm white and foreign. He's white and local. Okay, great. I also heard gordo, which means fat, fatty. The guy who was fat didn't seem to want to stand up for himself. No, he didn't seem offended at all. I heard zurdo for a left-handed person. I've heard that a lot on soccer pitches. And indio, which meant indigenous person. So someone who looks more like a native. And these were common nicknames tossed around by these people of different cultures, countries, and skin tones. And no one had a problem with anything. Which then brings me to gringo. Gringo's a fun word. I actually really like it. Doesn't bother me one single bit. But I did meet some people who were from the US who were genuinely offended by the fact that people called them a gringo. Well, I learned something else interesting about gringo. In Central America, I was told it means more North American white person, and that it doesn't mean Europeans. They're not gringos. But once I got into South America, white, foreign, gringo. Didn't bother me one single bit, because if people wanted to insult me, that's not the word they were using. They were going to actually insult me. And that's what I told this guy. I was like, look, if you're upset about a word they toss around that doesn't mean anything to them, and it just means something to you, you have to choose. Are you going to just decide not to listen to it anymore and not be here and just not come? Or are you going to learn a little bit about that cultural sensitivity and just not be so offended because that is not their intent, right? I don't know how he ended up going about it in the end. We didn't really travel together or anything. He wasn't a friend of mine, but I just thought it was interesting for him to note that. And I also mentioned to him, think about hand gestures. Like, there's a hand gesture that I habitually use. It's to throw a peace sign in the air with the back of my hand facing you. Now, in America, you do that. It's like, yo, peace, later, dude. That's what it means. You go to England and do that, and it actually just means fuck off. My father's English. Half of my family is from England. I have made that mistake of saying goodbye to someone in that way, and my family checked me. They were like, dude, you do that here, you're going to piss people off. Which now leads me to this whole idea. Troy Deeney talked about how the FA needs to set up programs to educate foreign players who come in. Because if it's not Edinson Cavani's fault that he didn't know that that's a problem, then it's on the FA to actually put together some kind of educational program for pros when they come into the league to be told, hey, these are things that are going to get you in trouble. If you say these words, it's not going to go well here. That would be really helpful, because then down the line, you don't have to ban a guy for 3 games for a cultural misunderstanding, and essentially also put him under this really difficult position where he's almost now kind of labeled half as a racist to some people. People who don't know anything about the nuance of the situation will have assumed Edinson Cavani is racist, when his friend Pablo Hernandez clearly sticks up for him saying he's not. So, this brings me to the final piece, the punishment. What is the point of it? What did it really achieve? Do I think it advanced the conversation? Actually, yeah, because I actually decided, hey, this is now more interesting for us to weigh in on and chat about. But do I think it improved the situation of racism and discrimination? No. I actually think it just made things more confusing for people. Where now, in England, by the way, the country that has probably the most ugly, imperialistic, and colonialistic history, is now telling foreigners who come to the country that they are racist if they use certain words, when in their culture, which also sometimes may have been a culture colonized by the English, in their culture it's not offensive. And we're going to police you and throw the book at you if you use it here, because the FA, we, this white governing body, we are the moral purists here. The whole thing just doesn't fit. It doesn't fit for me. I'm sorry. The other problem is, are we, in that vein, are we not only ignoring other cultures and the way they just speak and use words, and can we meet them halfway and try and come up with an understanding and educate? And are we also going to actually admonish their culture and say, that is bad? The fact that you guys have that terminology that floats around between you guys, yeah, do it where you are, but you come here and we consider that to be racist. We don't care if you're not being offensive to each other at all. We think you are, and we're just going to ban you for this. You can see where it's starting to get messy, right? I don't really know if this ban made anything clearer for anybody. The only thing I think that Edinson Cavani really learned from this is, don't say negrito in England. But if you think let's say he goes back to finish his career in Uruguay, do you think he's going to be like, I can't say that because the English don't like it? No. So all you've done is teach Edinson Cavani what the line is. When, like I said, you could have done that with an education program at the beginning. The other problem is, did this actually help? What did we all learn from this? I hope that we learned a little bit about different cultures and how, when they come together, it's important to be diplomatic and have a peace-minded approach to try and, come up with a like-minded solution and conclusion to the whole thing. But I'm really not sure if that's where we got with this whole thing. I think maybe this just got more confusing by the FA wanting to take a stance and be punitive and show that they were not going to stand for this at all. Well, in the end, you took a stand against just simple cultural differences and a cultural misunderstanding. And I wonder if this is going to prompt them to think about education. Because I would rather see education than just punishing people for misspeaking or misunderstanding culture. So again, if you were offended by this, no problem. But I do think that these cultural differences between us, if we're just going to admonish each other for them, where are we going? I mean, that's kind of what I talked about yesterday. We're all human. We're all the same. Our differences make us spicy and interesting. We don't need to constantly highlight our differences to then attack each other. We don't. So, this is Campfire Football. Tomorrow, I'm just going to talk about the pitch. It'll feel good. Have a great one, everybody.